Hello, hello, hello. How are we all? Guys, we're going to give it a couple more minutes and then I'm going to get stuck in, okay?
Sweet.
How are you, Maximus? You well?
Very well, thank you, bro. How are you?
Good, alive and kicking, slowly coming out of the prep hole.
You're looking alive, mate.
What's that?
You're looking alive.
Oh, slowly.
Yeah, we like it. We like it.
It's we're getting there. Let me just connect this a minute. How's your day been? You trained today?
Yeah, bro. I just battered a bit of shoulders and triceps. I've designed a new split over the weekend, so I'm just giving it a go this week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've put 2 intense cardio sessions in because I'm trying to look after the old ticker.
Good.
So yeah, I'm just seeing how it all goes together. But so far, so good.
What's the prompt with initial sort of changing the setup?
Do
Has
you know
anything
what, bro?
happened from a
I've always
proactive?
I've always loved high intensity cardio, like specifically the concept rower. Like I'll do 10
Yes.
by 10 by 500 on that. And then I dropped it out for like the last 6 weeks of prep because it would just make me too hungry and it was just so fatiguing. So the minute I was done with shows, I was like, yeah, let me get back into this. And then a mate of mine, he's doing some high rocks crazy shit, and he was like, you need to give this a go. I'm not high rocks, but he does he does 1,000 meters on the rower, 1,000 meters on the ski erg, and then 1,000 meter run, but I can't run because I just get crazy lower back pumps. So I put the assault bike in place of that. So I've just been doing rounds of that, bro, like twice a week, seeing how many I can get up to. And yesterday was my most successful day. I managed 3 rounds of it, so 9K
Love that.
at 102 kilos, which I'm happy with.
That's a very, very good effort. I was just about to say, when you said about running out, it's just like you're too big of a human to run, mate.
No. Mate, the thing is, we tried to film it.
Unless it's to the Krispy Kremes.
We tried to film it, and I just looked like this, like brick, like trying to run like this. And
yeah.
Just like I watched the video back. I'm like, I'm not doing that again, and it fucked up my leg training for the rest of the week. So I was like, fuck that.
It does, mate. It's surprising how those things can have a massive impact. Like I'm going back to training this week. It's my first session back, and after 10 days off, my step count was just kept super, super high. Like I was between like 15 and 20K a day. But now getting back into progressive training, I'm in a position where I'm like, I can't physically maintain that because the deterioration and fatigue set point that I'll be at will be pulled away from my performance in the gym. Do you know what I mean?
And that's what it's all about, isn't it?
Mate, we've got to be able to turn up every single day.
I've stayed at 12K after shows, and I feel like that's manageable, and it's keeping my body composition quite nice. And it's not like, oh, I have to do steps. It's just like I'm doing it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think if you take a proactive approach, first thing in the morning, get yourself out and get yourself moving.
Yeah,
you're in a position where you can box a good 25% off first thing, 3,000-4,000 steps, and then the rest will just accumulate over sessions. Right, guys, we're going to get stuck in. I don't know how many people we've got, but I am very, very grateful for you all to be here. Essentially, what we're going to be doing is talking about the webinar specifically is about PEDs on prep, getting peeled safely. Okay, now what I really want to cover, and there will be as much time as I can give you and you will give to go through questions at the end for maybe more specific questions, but I want to get us into the mindset of, I think, appropriate and effective management and understanding of what you want to be doing when you are navigating and transitioning from a phase specific goal like off season or recovery phase, and then laying the foundations going into prep, what is your mindset, and how are we going to effectively, as I said, navigate through that time frame, but do it as optimally from a results and progression standpoint, but also from a longevity perspective as well. For you guys who have never competed before, you may look at that and initially think, well, surely if you're in the best shape of your life, then you might have to be doing more as opposed to less. And then some of you who have gone through prep before have potentially been exposed to unbelievable amounts of high androgen exposure or just assistance protocols in general that actually bear no relevance to you as a biological individual and your current positioning as an athlete, quite simply. And that is the big caveat here that I really want to get across. Depending on who you are and where you are in your journey as an athlete will very much depend on the level of risk that you're going to take and the level of risk you need to take as well. Okay. So I want to get us thinking and understanding about, most importantly, what's necessary and what's not, potentially for you as an individual, having a good opportunity to have self-analysis of current positioning, and then obviously where we go from a trajectory standpoint from there. So moving forward, a couple of questions that I think we should always ask straight off the bat. What is the purpose of prep? Okay. The purpose of prep, quite simply, is to maximize fat loss and minimize or manage fatigue. Okay. That is simply all it is. We want to try and retain as much muscle tissue as we possibly can, whilst removing as much body fat and adipostule tissue as possible. That is it. Okay. Now, that answer and question, quite simply, will give you everything you need to know in terms of how you should be managing yourself through this process, or how you should be managed. Now, again, I'm not here to tell you how your coaches or you as coaches should be managing your clients, but quite simply, or should be managed as a client, but quite simply, it's again, the relevance of what you are actually trying to achieve. Now, how do we ensure prep is successful? Well, by laying the right fucking foundations, right? Understanding where you are as a biological individual, understanding the position point you need to be in at every single phase to be able to continue to actually move forward. My connection is horrendous. Is there any option to watch back later? Mark, yes, there is. This is being recorded, so you are all good. All right. So if you're having troubles, if you're having trouble hearing, then obviously you can just rewatch it. Okay. Now, how do we ensure prep is successful? So quite simply, as I said, it's about laying foundations, and that will go for every phase specific goal you are in. I think what we also need to consider, certainly in a position where we are talking about assistance specifically, is exposure. For females, if you're on and you're listening and you're watching, for females specifically, you're going to be looking at duration and dose. For males specifically, you're going to be looking at exposure from a dose perspective, and then again understanding what you actually need specifically. Are you actually ready? Have the foundations gone into place? How many times have you seen, as athletes, fellow athletes, be in a position where they do a shotgun prep and they're in a position where the proximity to stage is 20 kilos and they've got 12 weeks to do it? What type of abuse do they have to put themselves under from lipolytics exposure, from a position where they feel that because they have to drive so hard from a dieting perspective and get so much adipostule tissue off or removed, that they have to overexpose themselves to androgens to be in a position where they may actually be able to retain any type of tissue that they've previously accumulated in other phases. But again, I think as a well advanced athlete, and I will say this, if you are shotgun prepping and you're not in a position where you should be shotgun prepping, I would say that previous phases that you navigated through probably weren't very productive in the first place. But if I've upset anybody by saying that, then I don't care. Laying the foundations. Okay. So understanding current positions of health. Now, I think to give you a synopsis, an example of what you should be looking at when you're understanding your own current position, I'll give you my example. So I suffered 2 heart attacks 18 months ago, 18 and 16 months ago. My ability to expose myself, or even, to be fair, the correct way of saying that would be overexpose myself, because I was initially shooting and growing towards an open class super heavyweight bodybuilder, taking an enormous amount of androgens, and happy about it, to be honest, because that is in essence part of the reality of trying to accumulate as much muscle tissue as you possibly can. Now, when coming away from that reality, or when facing that reality initially, my first priority, naturally, Cameron's joining, 2 seconds, guys. When facing that reality initially, I was like, right, okay, androgen exposure can't be in play. However, I can't completely remove what at the time I had been exposed to upwards of far too much, thousands of milligrams of androgen exposure per week. Being in a position where I can no longer expose myself to that amount of androgens. However, I can't completely remove everything, because going from that level of androgen exposure with that amount of body weight, with that much stress on my body, to absolutely nothing is actually poses as much of a cardiac risk anyway. So what can I do, and how can I navigate through this? Fast forward, starting prep, which was essentially the beginning of this year. I was in a position where I could understand my androgen exposure level, and at the time it was running HRT or TRT, whatever you want to define it at. And that HRT base, an anchor for, you can say progression, but most importantly, recovery and support, that anchor sat me just shy of top end of physiological range. So essentially, I was in a position where I was functioning at an optimal rate as a physiological human being. Okay, I wasn't in super physiological ranges. So that should give us confidence, number one, that do we actually need to overexpose ourselves to androgens to have a positive prep? No, we don't. And I am the living proof of that. And it's not a bragging right. It's more of a confidence factor for you guys, that you know that if you are transitioning into prep and the idea is maintenance of muscle or preservation of tissue and fat loss, well, they're two very, very different things. And the reality of exposure for certain pathways are either going to be very, very relevant, or they're not going to be relevant at all. So that was the understanding from my initial exposure. I was like, right, I know that I can take up to 300 milligrams of testosterone a week at my current physiological state and stay within physiological range. Brilliant. I'm also in a position where I know what androgens or what pathways I can use that are going to drive cardiac risk and that are going to not drive cardiac risk. So these are what I'm working off. And this is how we understand our goals, number one, and then our needs to achieve those goals. So in fat loss, what are we going to do? Well, we want to try and maximize fat loss. What can we do? What can we use to do that? Right. Well, we can push cardio, we can pull food, we can introduce introduce lipolytics, we can do all manner of manipulations from a proactive and reactive basis. Okay. So when you look at yourselves, if you have prepped before, ask yourself, how much forward thinking was there initially prior to navigating into that phase? Were you in a position where you had various different health assessments done? You had markers to go off. Who's that? You had certain markers to go off to understand. Sean, 2 seconds, guys. You had certain markers to go off to understand where you were at your peak of off season, for example. Have you navigated through a recovery phase before to understand how in which you had recovered from a HPT axis standpoint? What foundations have you put in place? And then again, as a result, understanding the phase transitions that you've been through previously, how are you going to navigate through prep, understanding your needs and effectively, proactively and reactively manipulating certain variable set points. Okay. And there is there is very much a sort of process of, yes, okay, we can forward plan and we can understand how we tick, but sometimes we are going to have to reactively make changes to be able to continue to drive that response. So we talk about, and again, there will be time for questions after, but I've just broken these down just into small sections just to give you an idea of where we are. So all things that can potentially be relevant and also be completely irrelevant depending on who you are as an individual and again, what you need. So we've got testosterone as a baseline growth anchor. Okay. I said earlier, baseline growth anchor as well as a recovery anchor. That's going to be your foundation for your stack design. If you are the age-old human being or you've heard of someone that will just run Anavar as part of the end of their prep, potentially, okay, if you're a female, there will be some elements of effective deployment there. But as a male, and one of the case studies that I'll show you in a minute from one of the team guys on the team, like a baseline test, testosterone as an anchor for your progression, we should say, is more than adequate with other pathways to be able to navigate through prep without any other pathways and successfully do it and get fucking dug out. And you've got DHT derivatives, anabolic driver and cycle modulator. So there's two sections of this, quite simply, because DHTs don't aromatize. Number one, you're in a position where obviously naturally that paired with an anchor like testosterone will drive more anabolic and more androgenic response within the body, which is only going to be able to support your anabolic and then as a result metabolic functions. Metabolic function obviously supporting your ability to lose body fat, and then anabolic supporting your ability to retain muscle, and obviously not in a prep scenario specifically, but also potentially drive muscle tissue as well. From a cycle modulation standpoint, and I will show you this again on the case studies, but you're also in a position where because all you need essentially is androgen exposure, depending on where these two pathways sit, will depend on where your androgen to estrogen ratio sits, which will massively and drastically change the synthetic aesthetic view of your physique overall. Now, going on to 19 NORs, anti-catabolic agents and reducers of AMPK. So anything that will potentially, I don't see any other reasons for these being in a stack design, if I'm honest, certainly not in a prep phase scenario. That is predominantly what you are going to have it in for. Any drivers of an anti-catabolic physiological state, or sorry, a catabolic physiological state, that will be where you would deploy something like Tren. The reality and the big question, and a question that I always pose when clients ask or when anybody messages me and asks, they say, can we add Tren in? Are you peeled yet? No. So no, because essentially you're in a position where if you are simply just trying to reduce your ability to drive catabolism, well, I would say, could you risk being in a catabolic state without being completely fucking fatless? Not really. Not when the body's built to survive. Not when we're in a position as physiological human beings where the body is an engine to simply respond to stimulus points, where if we are in a position where we're underfed, then we can simply choose to run other options to be able to support our ability to retain tissue. And that's something you've always got to weigh up. And it's not to say that any of these are any better or worse for you, but again, it's just understanding the reality of deployment and whether you actually need it, and you are in a position where you need it. If somebody says to me, with the greatest respect, that they're 16 weeks out and there is deployment of Tren, why? For what? Understanding potential risk and potential reward from implementation of any of these pathways, which we've always got to do, I would say that that's a pretty poor choice of deployment, because you're not in a position where you could potentially be catabolic because you're 16 weeks out, so you will definitely still have fat on that ass. And you're also in a position where if you try and support anabolic and metabolic function, where you've got DHTs to be able to do that. Okay. Then we've got oral 17 alpha alkylate oral pathways. Now, for me, I would consider these as synthetic or performance management tools more than anything else. I think if I was going to try and increase, and these are tools like Anavars, other oral synthetic drivers, could be things like, and also performance management tools, could be things like Halo, could be things like Winstrol. And again, these are not to be implemented 4 weeks out. As soon as you get to 4 weeks out, right, Anavar and Winstrol goes in. And I think the reality of that sort of thought among our community, shall we say, is purely and simply just because the 4 week out mark is probably where things start to get hard, right? So that should be a time where you're pretty much there and you shouldn't really have much more work to do. You'll just be suffering at that point in time. That is normally, as you get to the arse end of prep, when you are in the trenches and you are dragging arse, that is the time frame that you will need support from a performance standpoint, because as soon as that performance starts to drop, the physique will massively start to change. So there's an element of performance management to be able to retain the quality of the look, and then also the synthetic response that we see from the androgen uptake and the way that these pathways actually bind to the androgen receptor and actually respond from a glycogen synthase standpoint, and your ability to materialize and turn over energy, and the visual response that it will give you from an aesthetic standpoint. Certainly when we're closing the proximity stage of weeks and days and even hours for some of them. Then we've got lipolytics and thyroid. I'll put these two together. Again, anything that drives metabolic output and fat loss capability. So lipolytics are going to be things like cleanse and your himbines. L-carnitines, I would actually probably put in lipolytics as well. We're going to be in a position where, again, these from a deployment standpoint to drive acute fat loss are very, very effective, extremely safe, and to be honest with you, would probably be introduced from day one, every single time. And it wouldn't be a question where we would look to implement Clen, your himbine, and L-carnitine all at the same time. However, there's no reason, considering they all have different functions, i.e. L-carnitine driving our ability to mobilize fat through the mitochondria and being in a position where we can actually utilize that fat as energy. Okay, so if we've got stored fat as energy and we're in a position where we can mobilize that and utilize that, well, surely that means we're going to be able to drive more fat loss. Absolutely. Okay, brilliant. So let's put that in. Clen, exactly the same process. Being in a position where we can mobilize and oxidize more body fat, drive more acute fat loss. Fantastic. There's recently been a study showed that an 80 milligram serving increases metabolic rate by 23%. Incredible. Absolutely fantastic. So you're telling me that sat at a resting state, I can be 23% more metabolic? Put it in me. Again, and still very, very safe. And then your himbine, be in a position where we can obviously mobilize or specifically help support the oxidization of body fat. No reason why that can't go in either. Thyroid, understanding, guys, as I said, the body is built to survive. We are engines, essentially, to just navigate through daily life. In a position where you are in starvation mode, where you could be driving signals like AMPK, for example, and pulling away from mTOR, which is our ability to turn over proteins and drive protein accretion and muscle growth, which won't be happening during a harsh deficit phase of prep. we're in a position where support through TSH, T4, and then the conversion to T3, which again drive metabolic response. GH in for recovery and also fat mobilization. Insulin for nutrient partitioning. A couple of you may be like, insulin, and I get it and I understand. But the reality is, if we are still in a position where we've transitioned, like some people will pull insulin straight away if transitioning from off-season recovery phase, potentially priming and maintenance phase, and then into prep, they'll be like, right, insulin comes out. Why? If insulin is a supportive mechanism for nutrient partitioning, if it also takes stress away from the pancreas and beta cell function, then surely, providing you're not going from 800 grams of carbs a day to 0, it still has its place. And again, until you're in a position where food is very, very low, I would actually argue that insulin should stay throughout prep. And then last but not least, ancillary. So you're looking at health management, stress and saturation management as well. So you're looking at an ARB like telmisartan, you're looking at metformin, insulin sensitizer. You're looking at any pathways that still help drive and support, although very, very little, drive and support GLP-1, your ability to drive turnover proteins and protein accretion, but also be in a position where we can manage stress and potential stress from androgen exposure and oxidative stress overall. Okay, that's just a brief overview. That's just an overview of all the things that I could potentially think of that would be effective and relevant in a contest prep scenario. So this is more about how we would look at phasing and transitioning through prep. Now, I'm hoping all of you guys can see this, but I've got a number of these and I won't go through them all, but some of these are going to be completely relevant. So you can see here the transition from prep, the transition from off-season into a recovery phase, into a priming phase, and then into fat loss and prep, and how in which certain pathways will be implemented accordingly. Now, you've got Stuart here, okay? Stuart's food adjusted, absolutely fantastic. We started his recovery phase. He's eating just over 4,000 calories a day, 600 grams of carbs, absolutely fantastic. We held those calories all the way through whilst keeping a baseline of androgens in, okay? We had bloods done, taken at the end of this recovery phase and priming phase to ensure that we were in a position where his health markers were in a good place, which obviously based on experience on my end with a hell of a lot of clients in these transitional phases, I can tell you that a baseline of 300 milligrams of androgens with testing primo had him sat absolutely perfect. He's still got some ancillaries in, got provarin in, metformin, telmisartan at base doses. Again, insulin sensitizer stays, telmisartan stays as a baseline at 40 milligrams. Our multivitamin for bodybuilders, if you are assisted. And then all of the pathways that I would seem acceptable to introduce straight off the bat. Now, one thing we did see straight off the bat from his blood work at the end of his 8-week clearance, let me just go back here, at the end of his 8-week clearance was hormones, sexual hormones were in a perfectly good spot. However, thyroid wasn't absolutely fantastically optimal. So rather than be in a position where mid-prep, we take blood work and we're in a position where we say, right, this is what's working, this is what's not, which is the most ideal position to be in. We took, and that would be the reactive manipulations that would be needed throughout prep. We're going to take a proactive approach here. And if we're not seeing good enough conversion from TSH, T4 to T3, we're going to put baseline support in straight away. Again, supporting his physiological state, actually, in all fairness, taking over his physiological state, because we're going to be using exogenous support and literally keeping that as a baseline all the way through prep. Okay. The transition into prep straight off the bat was an androgen exposure of 600 milligrams. And what you'll see is quite a low baseline of testosterone and double the amount of androgens through MAST. Now, there was no specific preference in terms of Primo or Masteron. We know that there is neurological drive and benefit from having Masteron in. We've seen that, not an enormous amount of studies, but we do know that to be the case from anecdotally we've experienced. But not only that, some studies have shown that to be a benefit. But most importantly, setting the androgen to estrogen ratio in a beneficial place straight away. Okay. Now I'll explain that in a little bit more depth, but if we can lay the foundations again from a proactive standpoint, that transition to prep, not only straight off the bat, almost, what are we going from 300, 600 milligrams, doubling your androgen exposure, but still Stuart's androgen exposure got upwards towards 1,000 milligrams per week. Now that's 400 milligrams less than when he was in a growth phase. Why is that? Because he's not fucking growing. He is not in a position where we are trying to accumulate new muscle tissue. We are simply trying to preserve what he's got. So his exposure doesn't need to be as high as when he was in a growth phase, because it's not relevant, because he's not trying to grow. Okay. And then last but not least, the implementation of Clen. And then the only other androgens we would look to potentially implement throughout the course of this phase, as and when necessary, if necessary, would be Anavar, and then potentially Yihimbine for a support in fat loss. How are we getting on for time? Oh, not doing too bad. Okay, so with regards to Ricky, completely different setup here. Again, navigating from off season, the end of his 20-week push, into a rapid fat loss phase, be in a position where we can maximize our ability at a high sensitivity point where we can get some of the work done early, laying the foundations, being proactive. Now, the best thing about running this rapid fat loss phase was not only the amount of fat loss that got removed, putting him in a productive position prior to prep, is it actually gained an enormous amount of sensitivity with, and again, cleaning for those 4 weeks for some acute fat loss opportunities. But it also put us in a position where we can return to a physiological or closer to physiological state of 200 milligrams of test, 200 milligrams of mast, and hold that throughout what we can consider as a priming phase prior to prep. So we focus on food as an anchor for supporting tissue, and a little bit of a rebuild and a refresh prior to navigating into prep, but then keeping androgens low before jumping straight back in. And all we look to do from a escalation standpoint is increases baseline from 400 milligrams injectable androgen exposure to 600. And then the only other pathways that are indifferent to Stuart would be L-carnitine. We didn't even consider, and haven't even considered at this very moment in time, the use of Yihimbine, just due to the way of his condition set point being good from here, his sensitivity being good from here. So that initial transition into week 1, week 2, and then moving forward from there has been extremely productive. And as a result, nothing is needed to change in over 5 weeks, which is perfect. Again, completely different phase, but you get the gist, guys. This recovery phase was a little bit longer, along with the priming opportunity, and then navigation into a slightly different paradigm and set point of 3-1. So you'll see here, if we go back with Ricky, we ran a rapid fat loss phase of 4 weeks on a paradigm perspective and how we wanted to set his pushes and pulls up. Stuart, however, hasn't got that in, because what we'll do, we'll work on a basis of as and when is appropriate to refresh you, we will. But for some of these guys, we're in a position where we're running this phase every 3 weeks, because we know from a productive off season how quickly we can accumulate fatigue, how quickly we can maximize the level of adaptive response we see before having to pull back. Okay. Now, modulation of estrogen. This is a very, very good example. And here you can see a reactive approach to prep, including the priming phase. But we had 2, 3, 4. We had 6 weeks, 7 weeks worth of digging before we returned back into maintenance, refreshed. Step count was kept super, super high throughout this time frame, apart from the times where we returned to maintenance to help support refresh. But the change in assistance, this is someone who has had a baseline at the start of prep and prior to prep, a baseline of testosterone. It's his first cycle. John's in a position where he's moving into his first ever bodybuilding cycle, or his assisted exposure phase. He doesn't need anything more than testosterone at all. And the small titrations we made were literally 40 milligrams per week, as and when was necessary. And that took us all the way up to 360 milligrams when he was essentially 5 weeks out, 4 to 5 weeks out from his show. Now, guys, when we talk about management of estrogen, what we're really talking about, there's also an element of like aldosterone, but we're talking about the look and visual change that estrogen can give or make on the body. And essentially, the only way to describe it is potentially soft and potentially watery. Now, we have to take into account that at a time where you are starting to get dug out, very, very dug out, and your condition set point is very, very good, the only way to assess what is still fat and what potentially is stress fatigue and, I don't know, a slight modulation error from an assistant standpoint, for example, is to make adjustments. So what you could do, you could look at potentially utilizing something like an AI to reduce estrogen over a short time frame, see how the body responds. But we were confident, based off some blood work that we had done in and around here, knowing full well where his testosterone was sitting and his estrogen was sitting and where that relationship was sat, that we could completely remove testosterone, knowing that we could safely reduce the amount of testosterone in the serum, which naturally, because of the relationship that testosterone has with estrogen, what goes up must go up, what comes down must come down. So if testosterone starts to decrease within the body, then so will estrogen. So it's a safe way to modulate it. It's a safe way to pull that estrogen down. And we worked out from a clearance standpoint how long that was going to take, which is why we pulled it here at week 52 after his maintenance phase. And what we did to replace that androgen load, because what's going to happen, right? Let's say your testosterone is sat at 14 nanomoles, you're outside of physiological range, you're working as an optimal human being, super optimal, super physiological human being. You're in a position where if you remove that support, that is going to decrease massively. Now, is that going to make a difference to the visual look and quality of the physique? Absolutely. So if we can hold the androgen exposure in place, but still be able to pull down testosterone, as a result, reducing estrogen, we're in a very, very good place. So that's why we replaced testosterone specifically with Mastron. Okay. And as a result, we were able to clear the testosterone in an adequate amount of time to land him on stage dry as a fucking bone. There wasn't an ounce of fluid or fat on him, which was absolutely incredible. So it's a very good example of how you can modulate estrogen, understanding where your estrogen and testosterone levels are actually sat. I think someone's trying to get in. Josh Murray. Understanding where your testosterone and estrogen relationship is, how that relationship is sat specifically, where we are from a ratio perspective of test to estrogen or androgen to estrogen specifically, and then making adjustments from there. And then last but not least, talking about how we can actually manage the process into your shows, right? So you've gone through all of the deployment of certain pathways and understanding what's your why, how you're going to utilize certain pathways, etc. Now we're just going to finish it off, okay? And this is essentially what we would look like. We look at a peak week plan and then show day plan, and this would be essentially from a PEDs perspective, where we're going to be reducing fatigue, where we're going to be reducing stress and understanding what pathways cause certain stress. They all cause stress, but also being in a position where you can effectively be in a position where you where you can understand what's in place. More is obviously being more, so that more needs to be removed, quite simply. Okay. And then show day, obviously hour by hour, how we would manipulate androgens, and how we would manipulate everything to be in a position where we can just land that perfect physique. All right. Now I'm going to give the floor to you guys. Obviously, I've talked a fucking hell of a lot. It is almost an hour that we've been on the call, so I'm going to let you guys shoot with any questions if you've got any. Thank you for listening.
No worries. Yeah, I'd like to ask a question, bro. I noticed on one of the case studies you have insulin there. Have you got a preference over Lantus or Humalog, or what do you kind of go for?
Lantus as baseline insulin.
Oh, okay.
100%.
Any reason you choose that rather than like a Humalog?
Just the need for support from a rapid acting fat loss, a rapid acting insulin in prep is not really going to be relevant. The only time I would look at a fast acting insulin would be in loading, if we really needed to. So, but to be honest with you, understanding how these different insulins work, I would say Lantus should be in on a daily basis anyway. Certainly in a progression phase, in that transition with a higher calorie set point, I would stick with Lantus, because that would be our baseline more than anything else. And then I would only use Nova if we were in a position where we were taking a hell of a high dense meal on, or a number of meals in, let's say, practice peaks, for example. But one thing we've got to realize, and we have got to remember, in a prep phase, your level of insulin sensitivity is already going to be high.
Yeah.
Your ability to break down, partition into liver nutrients is going to be fucking superhuman. So the reality of you needing like a Nova Rapid or Humalog, like anything from a fast acting perspective, is pretty low, unless you are loading heavy. And that would be the case where if you were trying to drive into a cap, for example, you had 8 hours to put in a shitload of food. That would probably be the only time I'd look to implement it.
Cool.
Does that answer your question, bro?
Yes, thank you very much. Also, your metformin is like what, 3,500 meg a day for some people?
Week.
Sorry, right. I was going to say what.
Yeah. It's a fucking It's a big bolus. That's
basically just 500 meg a day, basically.
500 meg a day. Yeah. So how I break down my sheet specifically is androgen load, or load specifically throughout the week, and then I've got a cycle and stat design sheet that will take you through daily implementation and deployment.
I was looking at that like, fucking hell. I'm not taking enough.
Corey may not bang loads of fucking primo, but he bangs a hell of a lot of metformin. That's the secret to his fucking
metformin
hair loss.
Slim sleep.
Slim sleep. I am fucking slim sleep.
The slim stuff really interests me, bro. It's something that I kind of got turned on to last year, and I think it made dramatic differences in my physique, even without using growth hormone. I still like to use it on like high days, but I use Humalog pre and post workout. I was just really interested to see your sort of protocols with that side of things.
Yeah, and again, I think from a progression standpoint, again, your pre and post are going to be the biggest carb boluses of the day, right? So that's where you're going to need the most amount of support. There's also an element of I don't want to say performance increase, feel good factor whilst you train, which in turn will turn over an increase in protein accretion, etc. Because naturally you're in a position where you train harder, right?
Yeah.
So there is neurological benefit there. But yeah, I think it's very, very good, and certainly move anything that can help support the body to really effectively navigate on a day-to-day basis. Like I think, and mate, I'll be completely honest with you guys. I've got guys on the team that have said to me after 4 weeks, bro, like you've pulled my food down. Are you going to pull my insulin? Like for what? Yeah, you're still eating food. Like there's still an element of needing to maximize nutrient uptake and delivery capabilities, is there not? Or do you not need to utilize that food probably more effectively now? Oh
Definitely.
yeah, that's a good point. Do you know
There's
what I mean? So
there's always such a fear around insulin. I don't really understand like why. You mentioned like insulin to people, and they're like, oh no, I don't touch that. I don't do that. I'm scared of doing it.
yeah,
And it's
yeah.
like,
But
mate, you're
they'll
not
bang
using-
Bolden on.
yeah, yeah. But I'm taking 3 ml a week.
Yes, yeah.
But it's like, mate, millions of people, diabetics, in like, inject themselves with insulin like every single day, and they're not as meticulous as us. They don't know what carbohydrates they're eating, and
Correct.
nothing really goes wrong for them. Like the only things that can really go wrong is if you're an idiot and can't count the syringe. Like,
Yeah, and to be honest with you, like there'll be situations where you can go hypo from a position of effective meal timing and managing energy balance effectively, etc. But providing you are in a position of knowledge and how to manage that specifically, like if I was to ever introduce it to a client and they did have concerns, it's just like mate, I remember when I first started using insulin, I was a young guy. And again, back then there was no direction really. There was certainly no platforms in a position where you could actually educate yourself to that level, or anybody trying to educate you. So it was like walk around with a Mars bar in your pocket just in case.
yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
And that's like keep your fats down, like
exactly that.
But that's also
Exactly
the
that.
other thing is like, so you're like more of an advocate for Lantus, right? The reason why
Yep.
I quite like the faster acting is because I know what I'm putting in there and then is going to be like a little bit of protein, high carbs, right? Minimal fat.
Yep.
Now, if you're putting Lantus in the morning and then you're still
Yep.
accumulating fats throughout the day, or do you tend to opt for a diet that's generally lower than fat than what you'd kind of go for if they weren't using Slim?
To be honest, managing that insulin sensitivity and potential hypo or nutrient uptake capabilities where you could find yourself going hypo, I would actually increase fats to slow down digestion and be in a position where you can utilize that glycogen synthase opportunity on a longer term basis throughout the day. So if we put in, for example, if we put in a baseline of 10 IUs of Lantus, right, and we were running at 50 grams of baseline fat and we were running at 400 carb. Quite nice. If we were in a position where between meals we were almost going hypo, well, we can do two things. We could reduce our Lantus by 20%, or what we could do is we could increase our fats, providing we were in a position to do so. And this is the question, right? Are you in a position where what manipulations do you have to make depending on where you are in your phase, right? But if you're in a position where you can say, right, it's more important for me to have the Lantus in at 10 and have the carbohydrates in that place to be able to reduce stress on the pancreas and utilize nutrient uptake and partitioning capabilities. Okay, well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to increase my fats by 10 grams. See where that sensitivity is the next day. And this is where it's implement, assess, adjust. If you don't know what you're doing or why you're doing it, how are you supposed to navigate through these phases? So I would actually opt for, I would never prioritize fats over carbohydrates in a gaining phase until we're in a position where it was absolutely fucking necessary, but you'd never be in a position where you could do that anyway. However, fats wouldn't be unfavored in a position where you're using insulin for me.
I think I've kind of like adopted a little bit of like a fat is bad kind of approach.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
It's nice to hear.
Yeah, bro. Like again, I made this point on Instagram earlier about implementation of like food increases at the top of peak progressions. Like there's no direct right or wrong answer. There is optimal and suboptimal, of course. And if there's a way to make your process and journey more optimal, then we should definitely take it. But there's certainly like hiding away from dietary fats, for example, you could be in a position where you're potentially putting yourself at risk from a health and longevity perspective due to the benefits that some fats offer. Do you know what I mean? Be in a position where we can implement high fatty fish options. Well, I can't do that because that will put me 15 grams over my fat allowance. I'm only allowed 30 a day because I need more carbohydrates, so I've got an overrapid in. Well, how much more beneficial could that salmon be compared to the minimized 10 grams of fat that you don't want? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because I literally just did my bloods. It was what, 5 weeks after competing.
Yeah.
My HDL, LDL was not good, red markers basically. So then when I had the run through with the doctor, I was saying, oh, you know, I'm taking the train by JP Loveheart, and I'm taking, and he's like, talk to me about your diet. And I'm like, predominantly
Yeah.
like high protein, high carb, low fat. He's like, I want you to eat avocado, salmon, cashews,
Yep.
walnuts. He's like, yeah, your subs are great. He said he wanted me to put berberine in as well. He said,
Yes. Yeah.
great. He said, but there's dietary things that you can implement that I know when we do bloods again, you're going to see a big difference. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I will give it a go. So I'm on the more fats at the moment.
Yeah. To be honest, bro, like you'll see a benefit from an energy availability standpoint, an energy balance
Very
perspective,
satiating as
performance
well.
perspective. Mate,
Yeah.
incredibly,
Yeah.
If you're in a position like I, you'll know anyway, but I have become an absolute slag for nut butters. Like I haven't eaten nut butters. I've been on this earth for 27 years, and I can tell you for free,
Yeah.
genuinely, I have never eaten it until probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And I can't tell you how much I've missed out on life and enjoyment of food. But the reality is you're right. And there's so many tools and benefits from being in that position, quite simply, where you can manage satiation and you can manage enjoyment of food through utilizations of fat that do actually offer huge benefits, not just from a performance and progression standpoint, but as a result, health benefits as well. And I can guarantee if you've implemented those fat sources and you stick with that, along with obviously management of other variable set points, like those lipids would be in a very, very different spot.
We shall see. We shall see.
We shall see. Keep
Someone's asked
me
you a
up to
question
date.
in the thing. Don't let me steal up everyone's questions and that. So
Not at all. I've got one from Omar. You can jump on, bro, but I'll read it out. Omar here from Dubai. Now, my question is regarding the peak week manipulation. Is there a specific androgen that you advise not do much changes in during that short period of time? If yes, which for you? Thanks for the great talk. Thank you for listening and being patient and listening to my whiny voice and watching me on screen. So for me, and this really comes down to, so I'll be honest, right? For the three pathways that I mentioned, Anavar, Winstrol, and Halo, I cannot tell you, as from an anecdotal perspective, what has been and will be more effective in the time frame that I've used them. Genuinely, I've used them all at the same time. I've used them all separately, and when I used them at the same time, I couldn't tell you what was doing what. When I've used them separately, I could say, yes, this is beneficial. So there is a very, very big argument to say that all of them are effective in different ways. Halo, for example, extremely, extremely effective from a performance standpoint, performance support mechanism standpoint and tool, but so is Anavar. Does Winstrol bring a harder look? Maybe, or maybe the drive and change that it makes within your physiological being in terms of receptor sites, maybe that's what changes it. Maybe it doesn't just dry you out, but effectively it essentially does, doesn't it? So in answer to your question, and I won't bullshit you and say that one is better than another, they all have a place and they are all effective. One of the most effective things that I've seen, I'm going to be completely straight up and honest with you. One of the most effective things that I've seen from a glycogen synthase standpoint, from an anecdotal perspective and deployment perspective for clients, is Superdrol in a peak in the closing window of prep, where we are in a position where we're loading. It's protocols that super heavyweights use to load specifically. There's no concern for me for potential to spill. And even if you do, there's obviously there's protocols in place for that. I'm not going to talk about diuretics on this call specifically because I think it will just get us into a very, very deep hole and you'll be here until next week. But Superdrol is probably one of the most effective synthetic changing manipulators of the lot, but don't hold any place, in my opinion, in the closing proximity. Halo, Anavar, and Winstrol for me all work as effectively as one another. I've used each and every one with different clients due to availability, legitimacy, quality, etc., and they all work effectively. So I hope that answers your question, Omar. Any more questions, guys? Oh my God. You're either all asleep or I've done a really good fucking job. Right. Cool.
Actually, sorry,
Go on.
before you go,
Hit me.
just a question about female exposure to something like an Anavar. At a low
Yep.
dose, we're talking 5, 10 milligrams. How long do you think you can push those weeks out for a female athlete?
Who's the female athlete? What are they trying to achieve?
Let's just say small bikini.
Okay. Are they going for a pro card or are they
They're going
first
for a
timer?
pro card. They've been using 10 milligrams on and off in the off season, whatever. You're now in
Yep.
prep, and
Yep.
they're obviously going to put Anavar in, but
Yep.
they're scared of exposure periods because they've read that, like, oh,
they'll grow a dick.
If I stay on it for too long, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm kind of the belief that at a 10 milligram dosage, you can really prolong that exposure. But what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. So I think first of all, 70 milligrams a week for an experienced athlete who is going for a pro card is very, very reasonable. The reality of more exposure than that at a amateur to pro rank and then pro moving forward is a hell of a lot more. And what we've really got to ask ourselves the question of is, yes, okay, you may be worried about virilization, but it's going to come down to duration as well as dose. So time frame, you would probably look to, I see most effective timelines for females. Obviously, Mads, the tank, takes over the female arm, and she works on a basis of 8 weeks from an exposure standpoint in prep. The only caveat, and obviously you'll understand this, the only caveat is you plan at 8 weeks out to implement assistance. Is that 8 weeks out from your first show or your pro qualifier? Is that the regional or the pro qualifier? Because there may be 4 weeks after that. So you may not be exposed for 8 weeks. You may now be exposed for 12 weeks. What if you give yourself 8 weeks until that show, that pro qualifier where you plan to win your pro card? What if it doesn't happen? You've got to ask yourself as the athlete, am I willing to expose myself for another 2 weeks, 3 weeks until the next pro qualifier? If you're not, then you have to ask yourself the question of how good are you as an athlete? If you can't turn up to if you can't turn up to a pro qualifier and win, are you ready? It may be the case where you're ready anyway and you just got a bad call. Know all about that. But are you going to continue because of that, or are you going to fuck it off? And that's the only question. If you're a first timer, you don't need to take it. If you're an experienced athlete going for a regional title, national title, then onto the pro card, you need to ask yourself the question of like risk and rewards. But an 8 week time frame is a really good place to start. 70 milligrams a week exposure, I don't think is barbaric at all. And it's only going to be the case where you have to ask yourself a question, going on to that level, amateur to pro and beyond, you are always going to need to expect to match the individuals that you are standing next to in some way, shape or form. Forget about biological individuality and genetic elite capability. If you are someone who is half-arsing an off-season because you don't want to expose yourself to androgens, but then you turn up on show day a year later than when you last stood on stage with these people, they've all progressed 40% and you've progressed 10 because you didn't want to expose yourself, then just enjoy competing. Don't expect to be an Olympian. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, facts.
Right, guys, I think if no one else has got any questions, I'm just going to end with this, okay? Some of you may have questions and may not want to speak up. So you can all take free consult calls with me moving forward. Haven't got a problem with that at all. For anybody on the call specifically that is interested in being in a position where you potentially want to talk to me about coaching, you are more than welcome to do so. I will offer discounted rates for all of you for listening to me to talk to you about what your goals are next. But I've put the link for the call in the group chat, in the chat below. Again, if none of you have got any questions, I will leave it with you. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for your participation. I hope it was helpful. And as always, if you need anything from me, just give me a shout. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Corey. Appreciate it.
Cheers, Corey.
Cheers, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.